I have a dream. 50 years ago today, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. repeated that phrase 8 times during his historic speech that captivated the country. The nation and the world is now honoring his words today with a presidential speech and bells ringing, all to symbolize Dr. King's call to let freedom ring. I have a dream, Dr. King said, that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King's children and the children of that generation have forged their own trailblazing paths, including the first black U.S. president, 2 black secretaries of state, a black attorney general, 5 black heads of Fortune 500 companies, black astronauts, and the list goes on and on. But now they have their own children who are seeking their own achievements, their own vision. The Dream, version 3.0. Before we look at the present, though, Keon Williams takes us back to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial 50 years ago.
People from all over the country converged on Washington to hear Martin Luther King demand equality for black Americans. The crowd of more than 250,000 stretched from the Washington Monument down to the Lincoln Memorial.
We're on the move now. The bombing of our homes will not dissuade us.
Prior to the March on Washington, Dr. King led a movement through the South, fighting for racial equality, many times with his own safety at risk, having to dodge rocks hurled at him. The rally marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, forcing it onto the national agenda.
You recognize who this is?
Eleanor Holmes Norton is now a member of Congress. 50 years ago, she was a young protester.
We had spent 10 years in demonstrations that had swept through every single southern state. There was really no place else to go. We needed remedies. There were no remedies in the South. There was only resistance.
Less than a year after the march, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which outlawed racial segregation. U.S. Representative John Lewis, who spoke at the march on that historic day, says Dr. King's dream has yet to be fulfilled.
We have made some progress. We've come a distance, but we still have a distance to go. We still have roads to travel. It was a march for jobs and freedom. There's hundreds and thousands and millions of our brothers and sisters without jobs 50 years later.
Gladys Mitchell, who was there for the speech, remembers just how moving it was.
When Dr. King spoke, that was it. He was fantastic. I have never heard another person deliver the way he did it on that particular day 50 years ago.
Lee Allen Williams drove all the way from California to be there.
And it was heartwarming for me to see and to hear and to have all of these different nationalities of people coming together.
Many commemorating the 1963 rally pointed to the Trayvon Martin killing to show that discrimination still haunts America.
50 years later, that you can gun down and shoot a black unarmed man on the street and get off. Is that an injustice or what?
Today, Dr. King's dream may still be away from being realized, but those marking the anniversary find themselves in a radically different society. Shaped by the impact of his words still resonating decades later in the presence of his monument, a lasting reminder of everything for which he fought. Keon Williams of Rise News.
Dr. King that day told the crowd that they came to the Capitol to cash a check demanding the riches of freedom and security of justice. He also told them to take a message home. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. So is the Dream 3.0 different from the first? With us to talk about that is Columbia University professor Dorian Warren, who has been a very busy man this weekend. Thanks so much for joining us today. The event originally was marked as a call for jobs and justice, and even though it was touted as a very key event in the civil rights era, it was an economic event. So How are lower and middle class African Americans doing now, 50 years later?
So it's a mixed picture, if we're being honest about it. On the one hand, we saw for the first time the rise of a black middle class in union factory jobs and public sector jobs, teachers, professors, doctors, lawyers. So we've made amazing progress over the last 50 years. On the other hand, some things have stayed the same. The black unemployment rate, it's still twice that of the white unemployment rate. It's been constant the last 50 years. Too many, for those black folks that can find work, the jobs don't pay enough. They don't have the same kind of benefit. So there's still incredible issues, economic issues facing African Americans today, as much as the community has made progress.
Well, back then there were only 5 black lawmakers in Congress. Now there are 43. The median income of African Americans has certainly jumped, but not by much. So there has been some progress.
But still today, almost half of all black children are in concentrated poverty. So again, it's a mixed bag. 2 steps forward, but we still need 2 more steps forward to catch up in terms of other economic indicators.
Part of the driving force for that, obviously, if you're African American or Caribbean American, you see it as race. Where are we now with race relations in America?
Well, again, we've come much further. The March in Washington was an event that we celebrate today, but at the time it was deeply unpopular. Everyone from President Kennedy and his administration down to ordinary white Americans in particular, were opposed. They thought it was too much. They thought it would be disorderly, that it would work against the civil rights movement. So we've come in terms of racial attitudes. We've come a long way. In 1963, we saw fire hoses and dogs and people spitting on black Americans standing up for rights. Today, we don't see that, obviously. Yet there's still challenges. There's still challenges of mass incarceration, of the criminal justice system, of, in this city of New York, stop and frisk. There's still other challenges around race relations, as we see in the Trayvon Martin killing, that still affect black Americans.
Well, when we go to the Trayvon Martin killing, obviously it's an issue also that resonates with white Americans, and some who have actually said they are now the victims of an overprotective society and they are the victims of reverse discrimination. Where do you see white Americans putting this whole thing into context? Do they think that African Americans have accomplished the dream?
They do. There's some public opinion polls released last week from the Pew Center that show that white Americans, the majority of white Americans do think that for black America the dream has been achieved. Black Americans are much less, they don't agree necessarily to the same extent. So white Americans think that the symbol of Barack Obama as president of the United States, that's the symbol that Dr. King's dream has been achieved. And I think what the president will say today and what we'll hear from other leaders who are commemorating this is that, yes, we've taken 2 steps forward, but there's still a lot more work to do. White America, black America, Americans of all races have a lot more work to do, and especially about those key economic demands of the march. We still have an immense amount of income inequality in this country, in addition to race. So you can't separate them out in some ways. They're both tied together.
Okay, thank you so much, Dorian Warren, Columbia University professor. Thanks for giving us your insight today. Well, ceremonies got underway this morning with the march to the Lincoln Memorial. Upwards of some 200,000 people are expected in the nation's capital for today's historic commemoration. Church bells will chime at 3 o'clock to symbolize the message, "Let Freedom Ring," to be followed by a speech by President Barack Obama. Arise News' own James Blue is there. He joins us now by telephone to give us an update on what the mood is like there. James, are you there?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Gary. I am here, and we've just had about 20 minutes of rain, and at the moment we have a Chicano labor leader who is speaking to us, and her mic has just gone out. So please welcome. But, there's a lot of people who are here really looking forward to this afternoon. And we just got Leanne Rimes singing Amazing Grace, which is quite a rendition, and she's really quite a crowd pleaser.
Do you see a good mix of people with regards to the spread of race? Is it a racially mixed crowd?
It is very, very racially mixed. Coming here, we saw all sorts of families, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, all people trying to get here for this important commemoration. And there's just a wonderful spirit despite the rain. This is something important that has to be done and that people feel that need to be witness to. Again, the idea is the event is here, but the action actually takes place back home in all the communities that people are from.
Thank you so much, James Blue, Arise News Director of Special Projects and Special Events. Now on to the other major story of the day, the crisis in Syria. The clock is winding down towards a Western showdown in retaliation for the Assad regime's alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria's civil war. That story tops our Across Our Eyes today with Colin Campbell, who joins us now from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., with details. Colin?
Hi, Gary, that's right. Inspectors are on the ground in Syria, and they're looking to see whether chemical weapons were used by the Assad government on Syrian civilians. It says that it will take about 4 days to complete this report as they look at the types of chemical weapons that may have been used, how long, the amount of chemical weapons that have been used. Meanwhile, in the UK, they are drafting a resolution to condemn chemical weapons attacks in Syria and possible military action.
Also in the news today, the case of Major Nidal Hassan, the Army officer convicted of killing 13 people at the Fort Hood Army base. Tell us about that.
That's right. Major Nidal Hassan is still in the sentencing phase right now. And according to prosecutors, he should get the death penalty. That's what one prosecutor asked for today as they tried to decide whether or not he should face the death penalty or life imprisonment.
And another chapter in the killing of Trayvon Martin for George Zimmerman. What's the latest there?
That's right. George Zimmerman's attorneys feel that he should receive compensation that he's allowed to from the state, $300,000 worth of attorney's fees. Meanwhile, Zimmerman's wife will face perjury. As she faces perjury charges, will take a plea deal that will allow her community service.
Thank you so much. Colin Campbell joining us from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Well, Alabama was the epicenter of much of Dr. King's fight for equality. Dr. King was jailed in Birmingham. The police turned water cannons and dogs on demonstrators. The dream was that one day the state of Alabama would be transformed into a situation where little black boys and black girls would be able to join with little white boys and little white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers. Glennon Threatt grew up in Birmingham. He vowed to never go back there after he left for college, but he did. He's now an attorney in Birmingham. Mr. Threatt, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, your experience in Birmingham, as we said, was so traumatic that you left and you vowed to never go back, but you did in 1997. Why?
I had changed in terms of what I required. I had developed my career to a point where I thought that I would be able to inject myself economically and financially here as a professional. And also, the city had changed tremendously. The demographic composition of the city had changed. The economic basis of the city had changed from manufacturing to a knowledge-based economy. And it was just a very, very different place because most of the de jure segregation had all been ended by civil rights, and a lot of the de facto segregation had ended as well.
Also joining us by telephone is Judge Helen Shores, who also made the same vow to not go back to Birmingham, but she is still there. Now, the world saw this as the epicenter for the civil rights struggle. Those pictures with the dogs, the water cannons, billy clubs, and of course, the famous or infamous Bull Connor. Now, was life in the city accurately portrayed in those footage reels? Ms. Shores?
Yes, I think they accurately portrayed what was going on in Birmingham during the time. Yes, they were accurate.
Now, Ms. Shores Lee, your father was also very involved in the civil rights struggle. Did you yourself, as a child at that time, did you find yourself putting up your own forms of resistance during this period?
I did. As a child, I was very defiant in terms of what was going on, and I really couldn't understand why I couldn't do certain things, like go to the amusement park, like
Glennon Threatt.
I was a child too, and I saw other kids playing and riding the carousel. I questioned why I couldn't do that. But yes, I was very defiant. I drank from the white-only water fountain. I moved the board on the bus that separated the colored section from the white section. I did that as early as 8 years old. I drank from the water fountain as early as 10 or 11 years old. So I was very defiant, and generally when I got home, I was scolded or spanked by my mother for being disobedient. I knew that was something I was not supposed to do. But as a child, if you told me I couldn't do something, I generally was going to go ahead and try and do it anyway.
Mr. Threatt, you told our producers that also, as a child, some of your tormentors were pretty rough with you. You bore names being called against you, you were beaten. But now that you hold no ill will for some of those tormentations. In fact, some of those people who did this to you as a child, you know them now and have relationships with them. And the question, obviously, that people would ask is, why hold no animosity?
Well, it comes from my Christian beliefs. You have to forgive people because forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. Otherwise, you harbor that hatred and it stops you from going forward. Our city, our country has got to forgive ourselves for some of the things that have occurred in the past, or else it restricts us from being able to move forward into a new multiracial society.
Now, there in the city of Birmingham, there is a stark and dramatic reminder of what happened there 50 years ago with the use of the dogs and the water cannons. There is this stunning park in which it tries to give people who visit it the experience of what it was like. Can you tell us about what the spirit was for the development of this landmark?
Well, you know, that landmark was developed in conjunction with our Civil Rights Institute, which is a tremendous museum if people get the opportunity to visit it. But for me, I've described it as almost being like in the movie The Sixth Sense. When I walk through that park, it's almost like I'm surrounded by ghosts because so much pain occurred there, and the statues that are there now reflect that pain. But for me, I know people who were there when all that stuff happened, and so it's a very surreal experience.
Ms. Shores Lee, you are now a judge. You've been able to climb some of the mountains that Dr. King spoke of. But as you look back now in terms of people memorializing this particular event and what it meant then, where do we need to go as a nation? Or more specifically, where does the state of Alabama need to go to see the fulfillment of Dr. King's words?
Alabama needs to move ahead, and I think our change will come eventually, and we're not there yet. We've made significant progress over the last 50 years, but Alabama is still, although the laws of Jim Crow are off the books, the spirit of Jim Crow still lives in Alabama today, and I think our future will come from our young children. I think we need to do a better job educating our young children, teaching diversity, not just giving it the language transition, but just teaching young people how to get along with other young people. I'm appalled today, as I have grandchildren in the school system. I'm appalled at incidents that happened with them in terms of the racial slurs that they've encountered from some of their classmates today. I thought that was kind of over. And if you want to look back, when Arthurine Lucy integrated the University of Alabama over 50 years ago, the campus was in an uproar. Riots broke out. The lady couldn't attend classes. Yet 2 years ago, when the University of Alabama dedicated Plaza and Clock Tower to Vivian Malone, Arthurine Lucy, and James Hood as the first blacks to integrate the university. Again, they didn't riot, but there was the racial name-calling of black students. There was the writing of ugly remarks all over the quad around the university. So it makes you question just how far we've come in terms of us getting along with each other.
Mr. Threatt, as a black man who was able to overcome the obvious treatment that you went through to rise to become an attorney, a successful graduate of Princeton University, when you look at African-American males today in society, What do you think is their biggest obstacle? And the second part of that question is, what do they need to do to take ownership of their lives?
It bothers me that perhaps the highest cost of death for black males between 18 and 30 is homicide. You know, and a large majority of the crime that occurs in the black community is perpetrated by black people. That's got to stop. I mean, we've got to take individual responsibility for our actions. Now, a lot of that people attribute to frustration because of lack of economic opportunity and education, but still, it's a series of individual choices that people make to violate laws and to injure other people in their community. That's just got to stop. The other thing we've got to start doing is to be more responsible in terms of our own communities, taking care of our children and being responsible to our parents and other people in our community. And a lot of that, again, is very, very individual. That needs to be done from a moral standpoint.
Attorney Glennon Threatt and Judge Helen Shores Lee, thank you both so much for taking the time to commemorate Dr. King's speech 50 years ago today. Now, not everyone who supported the march in 1963, the Nation of Islam's Malcolm X called it a, quote, farce on Washington. Dr. Khalil Muhammad is the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He's also the great-grandson of Elijah Muhammad, who led the Nation of Islam from 1934 until 1975. He is on the Mall today. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Tell me, what are your impressions of the atmosphere there today?
Well, I think people are extremely honored and happy to be here. I think that the weather is posing a little bit of a damper on the spirits. You know, people are trying to take cover. It's a constant rain right now, but overall, there's tremendous energy and excitement to be here.
Now, what did your great-grandfather think about the march himself back in 1963?
Well, his general policy was not to support the march, which was consistent with his black nationalist beliefs that there was nothing redeeming about the U.S. government and its failure to protect black life from his childhood and over the many years that he ran the nation. Interestingly, his most successful minister, the Minister Malcolm X, actually attended the march and although made many public pronouncements that were critical of the march, actually moved among some of the march leaders like Bayard Rustin and ultimately supported the march because he saw 250,000 black people and white people gathered here and knew that mass mobilization was historic.
Your great-grandfather, though, eventually changed his position with regards to the tactics, or at least the feeling that black Americans should have about the country. Is that accurate to say?
Well, my great-grandfather more or less stuck to the basic tenets of the Nation of Islam for most of his life. Malcolm X made the most dramatic conversion. I think what's more interesting is that Elijah Muhammad's sons, his youngest son, Appa, who was educated in Cairo, believed in coalition building at the time of the march, believed in a kind of color blindness that was a rejection of many of his father's official beliefs, as well as Herbert Muhammad, who happened to be the trainer of Muhammad Ali, attended the march, was on the grandstand as a photographer. So with regard to Elijah Muhammad and his own family members, there was tremendous diversity of thought, and ultimately the Nation of Islam moved mostly to Sunni Islam, and Farrakhan transformed that.
Very quickly, Dr. Muhammad, what do you think your great-grandfather would think about America today and at having it at the head of it, President Barack Obama?
I think he would ultimately be impressed with the tremendous change represented by the symbolic presence of a black man in the White House. I think that he would also see the ongoing challenges of racial violence as indicated in the Trayvon Martin death as indicative of an element of the white population that remains committed to repressing black people. I think he'd be concerned about ultimately the fact that democracy seems hollow in a nation that professes to be a beacon of democracy to the world. He would have some of the same criticisms today as he would have had 50 years ago.
Dr. Khalil Muhammad, the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, thanks for joining us from Washington.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And this is Arise America.